Hello, everyone. I'm here with author Gretchen Baskerville. She has written a great book about divorce in Christianity and the reasons why we may eventually seek a divorce, even in a Christian marriage. And it's called The Life-Saving Divorce. So I'm happy to welcome her here today. Thank you, Gretchen, for coming and being with us. I really appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy lady, so we are privileged to have a little bit of your time along.
It's just such a privilege to be with you, Julie, and with your organization, because what you're doing with helping victims of abuse is so powerful and so important.
Important work. So we're always glad to find resources and books and authors that are on the same page as we are, so to speak, and believe that abuse is not God honoring and never ever something that he would want us to deal with or put up with in any way, shape, or form. I also just started the book, the Lisa Tierkirch's new book. It's called Good Boundaries and Goodbyes. And it is about time. We needed a modern boundary book that's written in a very friendly way and easy to read. And it has a lot of insight. So I would recommend that to you and to all our watchers and listeners as well.
Great.
So, Gretchen, would you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit of your story and how this book came to be?
Yeah, so my name is Gretchen Baskerville, and I have a book called The Life-Saving Divorce. I just wrote it. Oops, hello. I just wrote it a couple of years ago because I have been a divorce recovery leader in conservative Christian churches since 1998. So for over 20 years, I've been leading divorce recovery groups in churches. I am a devout Christian myself. Let's see, where do I start? I want to make it really clear that I am not a psychologist or a sociologist. I am a lay divorce recovery leader. And you ask me, well, tell me your story. So let me give you kind of the rundown. I was that goody two-shoes Christian girl. I never drank or smoked or gave my parents any reason to worry. I was a good student all the way through. I mainly got into trouble by staying up past midnight reading my Bible in bed. My whole family was committed to the Lord and to the church. My parents were very good Christian examples. They've been married 63 years and counting as of today.
Wow.
And I was involved with youth group and youth choir. I went to Wheaton College, a major Christian college, and got my degree in Bible and Christian education. I mean, I absolutely believed and believe today that marriage should be loving, undefiled, and lifelong. I am a pro-marriage person, but I also believe in having some nuance because we were always taught that only that 95% of divorces were for completely frivolous reasons, grass is greener reasons. And only 5% of divorces were for something really, really serious. And I'd like to debunk that notion, but first let me tell my story. So I met my husband-to-be at the church I had attended since age 7. And as we dated, and how you get to know each other, he did reveal some things that I found to be a little bit troubling. So I recommended we do some counseling for nearly a year before we got married. So we actually entered premarital counseling with our pastor, and we were completely honest about our lives. But even though he brought up some serious red flags, our pastor felt that any marriage between two Christians would be successful and that all problems would be eventually solved. In addition, the pastor felt that the love of Christ in my heart would overcome the childhood trauma my husband had experienced. And he felt that my good, stable background and example would really inspire my husband to be a really godly man. We even went through the #1 best-selling Christian premarital workbook called Before You Say I Do. And I didn't notice at the time, but I since then dug up my copy of the book and read it about 10 years ago. I divorced 25 years ago, just to put this all into context. And I noticed that the book didn't even mention the word abuse or serial infidelity, or that any marriage could become dangerous or destructive. I then bought the newest version of the book, and it was essentially the same as the workbook we had used 35 years ago. And it promoted the same idea that the pastor did, that any marriage between two Christians would really turn out fine if you both, if you tried a little bit. So we were trained that we could just sweep serious problems under the carpet because they would all turn out okay eventually. We were trained to be a little bit gullible and blind and naive as we entered marriage. And I think that's a really serious problem. Anyway, we did everything right. My fiance got my father's permission to marry me, and I walked down that aisle in my beautiful white wedding gown. I was a radiant virgin bride and was so sexually attracted to my new husband. But within a few months, I knew that something was terribly wrong. And by the end of our first year, that same pastor who did our premarital counseling came to me and he apologized. He apologized to me for encouraging us to get married. But what could I do? I'm a devout Christian and I was against divorce. I'd been told that divorcing, even when there was serious sexual immorality, was a sign that you didn't take the sanctity of marriage seriously, or you weren't spiritually mature enough to hold on for God to do a miracle. And so I was stuck, even though Jesus himself said I was free to go. So over the next few years, there were more incidents of lying and deception and sexual immorality that was downright illegal. And by that time, I had 2 children under 3 years old, and I just didn't have the wherewithal to leave. We'd gone to Christian counseling with 5 different counselors and pastors, and even went through an expensive inpatient treatment program for a full month. But it didn't make any difference. I mean, whatever change there might have been didn't last more than about 90 days. I had been told that divorce universally destroyed children, and I loved my babies, and I was willing to sacrifice my life and my sanity to protect their future. So I stayed, and I continued trying. I had no idea that that was incorrect information, and that divorce in toxic situations like mine were generally found to be a benefit to children's well-being on average, not a curse. I wish I had known that then. After one last shattering incident 25 years ago, I filed for divorce out of sheer desperation. I was numb and devastated and absolutely fearful, but I couldn't have this man in my home another day. At that time, nobody ever told me that most people who divorce return to their normal level of happiness within 2 to 3 years of the divorce. These are averages, obviously. Your mileage may vary. No one told me that. I was just leaping into the darkness, hoping that my loving God would catch me. I had no hope for my future and no hope for my children either, but we had to get out. It was desperate. It took me a full year before I could smile again. And it wasn't until the end of the second year that I could really, laugh wholeheartedly, one of those great belly laughs. It took me about 5 years to get financially stable. But looking back, I would say the decision to divorce, although it was one of the most painful and scary decisions of my life, was also one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. I thought I would have a black cloud over my head. I thought I would have the red D for divorce stamped on my forehead. I thought that I would never be happy again. And I went on to have an incredibly blessed life, because the Lord really does restore the years the locusts eat. Instead of having devastated children who were emotional basket cases and juvenile delinquents, my children grew up, and by their teen years, they were thanking me for divorcing their dad. Even though they loved their dad, they felt that divorce was the best option in a really horrible situation. Both of my kids are in their 30s, and they both turned out great. And that actually should not be a surprise to anyone, because family researchers have known for 30 years that 8 in 10 kids of divorce turn out as well as their peers from married homes. But no one in our churches, no one on those Christian radio programs ever told us that. Now, I do want to be honest. My kids did have their ups and downs in middle school, a little bit in high school, just like any other kid on the planet. But they finished their educations, they got great jobs, and they've been good citizens, good neighbors, good employees, and good friends. So looking back 25 years, I can say that the Lord used my divorce and the aftermath to deepen my faith, to give me empathy and compassion, and make me an advocate for life-saving divorces. And by the way, as I mentioned at the beginning, life-saving divorces aren't just 5% of divorces in America. They represent about half of divorces in the United States. As a Christian, of course, I believe that there are frivolous divorces. Of course, I believe there are, I miss the single life divorces and I'm bored divorces. But that's not all divorces. And I think we need to be wiser and more discerning on this topic. And I feel like the Lord has called me to help people find clarity and support if this is truly the path they choose to escape a destructive, toxic situation.
Yes, thanks for sharing. And I'm sorry for mispronouncing your last name, everybody. It's Baskerville. I think I said Bakerville, so I apologize for
That's all right. A lot of people do that, by the way.
Okay. What is it about our brains? We just read through it and expect it to say one thing, but it says another. So I had, we oversee Her Journey groups, which are for ladies who have been in abuse. And it was life-saving for me, absolutely life-saving. And it has been for over 30,000 women now that we've put in it. And one of my leaders gave me a call a couple weeks ago, and she said, Julie, she goes, I went to divorce care at my church. She goes, because I'm divorced. I was looking for some extra support. There were 5 people, she said. One was a man and 4 were women. And she said, Julie, she goes, all 4 of those women had been in abusive marriages. And that's why they had to get divorced. And I was like, wow, that is a lot, And so she's like, I'm going to tell them about Her Journey and send them to the Her Journey program. And I said, that's wonderful. It's great. So they can go a little deeper, in their healing. So my question for you was, do you find, I mean, you mentioned the half, that a half of the kids turn out, to be half of the divorces are for those marriages, and 8 out of 10 kids turn out okay, is the stats that you said. Yeah. So in your divorce recovery groups that you teach and the people that you oversee, do you find that there is a large percentage that have divorced due to abusive relationships or toxic relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit of physical violence, but a lot of emotional abuse. What's really interesting is that even the most conservative, pro-marriage, pro-family think tank out there, the Institute for Family Studies, they have done a study in the last 2 years that was published, and they found that 1 in 4 highly religious marriages in America has a history of abuse. And that shocked me. I mean, even though I see it a lot, to be honest with you, even that shocked me. And when we're even finding that Christians, very conservative, highly traditional think tanks, are saying that their studies are finding that much abuse in our homes. We really need to take this seriously. This is not coming from some liberal organization. This is coming from an organization that's well known for being marriage promoting and trying to set up marriage enrichment programs.
Yeah, the mindset desperately needs to be changed. And speaking of that, both you and I agree that there's not in the past, and I was going to ask you maybe if you know more than this, but there's not in the past been a lot of focus in premarital counseling on, what an unhealthy or toxic or abusive relationship looks like. There's a
Right.
checklist of warning signs, like on our website, we have, a checklist of abusive behaviors. And it's the most common thing that people pick up when we do tabling events, and they go home
Yeah.
and they do it on themselves and they do it on their partner. Um, and there needs to be more. And maybe there has been. It's been a long time since I've been in premarital counseling. Have you seen any improvement in that, in your people that you're working with, that there has been some shift in premarital counseling to include that information?
Yeah, I mean, some churches write their own material, and some churches are accepting of the idea of giving a list of red flags, um, behaviors. But I'll be honest with you, there are still 18 denominations, big, large denominations in the United States or in North America in general, that still don't permit divorce for abuse, not even physical violence. And so they're not going to do a very good job in premarital counseling, I don't think. Let me tell you what I think needs to happen in our churches to get much, much better. I think the problem rests in two areas. One is their lack of biblical knowledge on divorce. And you would think, wait a second, I thought, these pastors, they've been studying the Bible a long time. How is it possible that they wouldn't know Bible verses on divorce? Every time somebody asks me that, I said, let's not talk about this until you can tell me the 3 places in the Bible where divorce was actually commanded, not just permitted, not just condoned, but actually commanded. When you can find those 3 places in the Bible, then come back and let's talk. The other thing I find is that churches don't have a good grasp of scientific research on the effects of divorce on kids and on parents. So what happens in our churches and with our Christian authors is they've simply been given incorrect information, and then they just repeat it and they put it in their books, and they don't even bother to verify whether it's correct. If I would love to inspire someone out there, maybe you, to write a brand new premarital workbook. I think a lot of what's in good Christian premarital workbooks is inspirational. They talk about what marriages ought to look like, but they don't tell us the red flags, as you mentioned. The other thing is they don't tell us the truth about divorce. So I have created an article online called 12 Positive Outcomes of Life-Saving Divorces that no one told us. Remember, these are the life-saving divorces. I don't think there are very many good positive outcomes from frivolous divorces, but there's absolutely no doubt scientifically from the world of family research that there are positive outcomes from life-saving divorces. So my article can be found at lifesavingdivorce.com/12 facts. That's the number 12 and then facts. So lifesavingdivorce.com, 12 facts. So as long as churches keep preaching using inaccurate information, they're going to turn a blind eye to the marriage endangering sins, and they're going to propel people into marriage too quickly. For example, one of the things you'll find from a lot of Christian websites is they'll say, we have a divorce crisis. The divorce rate is spiraling out of control. And the truth of the matter is that the divorce rate is at a 50-year low right now. And the reason for that is that young people are waiting longer to get married and waiting until they have more education. These newer marriages, these more recent marriages, are much more solid because they chose a partner when they had more life experience. They didn't just marry the first person they fell for because their church pressured them to get married so they could have sex. So let me give you an example of what I think Christian premarital books do wrong, and maybe someone will write one that does it right. Do you have a couple of minutes for us to discuss it?
Yes, we have a couple minutes for that. Let's go ahead and go over that. That would be great.
Okay. So let me go over the best-selling workbook that I used before I got married. And as I said, it has not changed in any significant way in the last 35 years. This premarital workbook, it was called Before You Say I Do by Norm Wright, says right in the intro that it's designed to help you decrease the risk element in the marriage. But when you actually read the book, the topic of dangerous behaviors in a marriage never come up. The workbook had a lot of good advice and some Bible passages about God's purpose about marriage, but all the examples of marriage difficulties were really minor, such as, communication problems that almost any kind-hearted couple could solve just by, listening a little bit better and trying to understand each other's views and expectations and compromising a little bit. In the workbook, the word infidelity appeared only once, and the author said that such behavior was inconceivable in Christian marriage. The word domination and the phrase unfair use of anger during conflict came up, but no warning bell was sounded in this book and no advice was given. These things weren't even identified as serious problems. There was an example in this workbook of being overly controlling with money and questioning all the receipts, but the comment was really mild. Oh, this is not how to start a marriage. Why didn't the author say more? I mean, intimidation, domination, control, these are really serious flags for domestic violence. But the book didn't even raise a warning. I mean, shouldn't a good premarital workbook do this? Believe it or not, the words adultery, lying, cheating, betrayal, gambling, pornography, and addiction didn't even appear in this premarital workbook at all. Nor did words like abuse, slap, hit, punch, push, or fight. I mean, the workbook never brought up any risky behaviors: abuse, adultery, prostitution, chronic lying, drug addiction, battering, child sexual abuse, any other behaviors that would destroy the trust in a marriage and jeopardize its future. They weren't even brought up. There was absolutely no instruction in this entire book to break your engagement or even to get counseling. It was as if these marriage-destroying problems didn't even exist in anyone you might meet at church. They said in the book that when undesirable behaviors did crop up, the reader was told that they could just learn to adjust. Does anyone have any questions about why so many Christian marriages are in so much trouble and are so destructive? It's because our churches didn't take marriage endangering sin seriously. And they didn't tell us, hey, I think you need to take a time out, get some counseling, or maybe break your engagement, or maybe put off this wedding for another year. Something is wrong here. But these books didn't do that.
Yeah, there's kind of been the attitude in our churches of as long as we push it under the rug, it doesn't exist. And yet we know that, we teach 8 types of abuse, and we know that our stats are exactly the same, sadly, in the faith community as they are in the secular community. And that's really sad that our churches have not been helpful in preparing people for that. for sure. And I do see what you say. The younger generation is waiting till later. My kiddos too, in their upper 20s are waiting till later. Whereas I think my generation was more like you got married at, 19, 20, 21, maybe 22. And that was pretty standard back then. And speaking of standards, you and I chatted about that the Bible really actually has the minimum standard of a good marriage or of marriage period. And I wondered if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah. Let's see. We may have to edit this out because I don't have a fast way of, let me just see if I can find a really quick way of describing this.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. We can cut it out.
Yeah, no worries. I know what this is like. I do a lot of editing when I do.
Yeah. You just got to write down from where to where, chop, chop, chop.
Exactly. Yes. So start I've got a really good 6-minute video on this. Let me see if I can just find my script from the 6-minute video. Because it takes a little bit. Okay, here, I found one.
Okay.
Okay. I found a short version. All right, because otherwise this could take a long time to describe. Okay.
All right. So Gretchen, we had talked a little bit about the minimum standards of marriage, and you actually informed me that those are in the Bible, which is very cool to hear. So I was wondering if you could share more with us about that.
Yeah, I mean, right, we don't really talk about this that much in Christian circles because we are told over and over to forgive, love, 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 sweep all betrayal under the carpet, reconcile, reconcile, reconcile. But that's not the ancient Jewish view of marriage. There in ancient Judaism, in the Bible, there really was a minimum standard for marriage. We as Christians today talk a lot about the ideals of marriage, but we never talk about minimum standards of marriage. We talk about how men should love their wives and care for them like their own bodies, but we as Christians don't really, I hate to say this, we really don't take that seriously. We view it as sort of romantic, idealistic talk, but not as being very realistic. We never draw a line in the sand except for adultery and say, this is the lowest level at which you can treat your spouse. This is the line you cannot cross. And we're all going to agree that if you treat your spouse this badly, a divorce is valid and justified. We today are so skittish of divorce that we end up condoning abusive marriages that drive the victim, often the wife, into despair, depression, suicidal ideation, and often make them homicide victims. I often say that divorce is not evidence of moral decay in our society. Tolerating abusive marriages is. So let's look at biblical times. In the Old Testament, in ancient Judaism, there were minimum standards for marriage. And we never hear about it because we tend to ignore some parts of the Old Testament. But evidently, bad treatment of spouses was a real problem in Old Testament Israel. Back then, there were wives of different statuses, just like there are now. You might marry a daughter of a wealthy man who brings with her a large dowry, such as a date palm farm that you as the husband can benefit from. You can profit off the dates that you sell from her date farm. On the other hand, you might marry a woman who you captured as a POW. You saw her tied up in a group of POWs, and you thought, she looks nice. The price is right. She's free. You don't have to woo her. You don't have to win her. You don't have to write her love letters. You don't have to pay a bride price. So with minimal effort, she's yours. But what happens if the husband no longer loves her and he resents the expense of feeding and clothing her, or he just gets tired of her. Apparently, men at the time of Moses just wanted to strip her of a wife's privileges, cut her rations, have her wear rags, and use her as a slave, either for himself or for his brothers and sisters, maybe even sell her and make a profit. And apparently this was a real problem during Old Testament times, so much so that Moses had to create a law about it. In Deuteronomy 21, 11 through 14, Moses commands that if you're not pleased with your POW wife, you must let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave. You must divorce her and let her go free, presumably to remarry someone who will care for her better. Here's another example. So notice that was a command. That was a biblical command to let her go, to divorce her for her sake. Here's another example. Exodus 21, 10 through 11. It talks about a man who has a slave wife. Again, another low status wife. This would happen when a fellow citizen who owed money to a lender couldn't pay him back. So the financially strapped man would give the lender his daughter as a wife to repay the debt. This is not a bride the lender was necessarily attracted to. He didn't woo her, he didn't win her, he didn't give her nice gifts. This is a woman he got in lieu of a debt repayment when he couldn't get anything else. He probably would have liked to have had something else, sheep, goats, maybe even nice pots. But by biblical law, he had to meet some basic level of care for her, food, clothing, and her marital rights, meaning love. Now, it's very likely that the lender would someday find a woman he really was attracted to and would marry her. Back then, they could have more than one wife. But Exodus 21 says that if he takes another wife, he cannot reduce wife number one's food, clothing, or marital rights. In other words, even if he never loved her, he can't be miserly, negligent, or malicious to her. If he is, believe it or not, he is obligated, he is commanded to let her go. And let her go means giving her a certificate of divorce, a document that proves that she is available to remarry. Now, let's say that he's a selfish guy and he really liked wife number one's cooking. It's a lot better than hot, chicky wife number two's cooking. But frankly, he's tired of paying for good food and a new outfit fit for wife number one every year. He'd rather use that money to go on a vacation or throw a party. So if you've read the Bible, you know that there were wives, concubines, and female slaves. He was not allowed to reduce a wife to concubine or slave status and to keep her as a wife. He couldn't just treat wife number one like a slave and send her to the kitchen to eat pig slops. He had only two choices. He could treat her right or let her go. So we modern Christians could really benefit from re-examining the Old Testament, the law of Moses that allowed, even commanded divorce to protect these low status wives. If there was a biblical standard of care for even these low status wives, how much more to regular wives? And if the husband refused to give her a certificate of divorce and let her go, it's very interesting. We find in Jewish writings that the wife's family or just society at large could go to the Jewish court, and the Jewish court would have the man beaten until he finally volunteered to let her go. Divorce was God's protection for women in the Bible. And we as Christians really need to have a more nuanced and biblical view of divorce in this area.
I had no idea. I mean, I've read the Bible, but apparently didn't get that context of all you mentioned. So I
Yeah. Oh, neither did I.
appreciate that. Yeah.
And, Exodus 21, 10 through 11 is absolutely the cornerstone of Jewish marital law. Even today, you will find that passage being used. It's you can actually look up. There are all kinds of stories about grooms being forced because they refuse to treat their wives properly. And these are in, very Orthodox Jewish communities. And there are actually assault rabbis who will go around and torture these men. And I'm not recommending this, by the way. So even though I have a smile on my face, I don't recommend this. Is completely against the law. But they actually go and make the man's life so miserable that he will finally give his wife a certificate of divorce so that she can get away from him and she can eventually find a man who really does love and care for her.
Mhm. Yeah, and we have in our materials that, God gave Israel her certificate of divorce,
Right.
and in addition, took her back a few times, to the chagrin, of that, because they continued to misbehave and behave badly. And so, we know that it grieves him, obviously, when families are broken up and there's divorce, and nobody walks down that aisle thinking, oh, I'm going to get divorced someday, right?
Right.
But the health of the people within the family unit and the marriage are so much more important than, a unit together with all of that. And I still hear a lot of, the Bible does not allow divorce in abusive situations. It's only for, infidelity, as an example. And
Right.
it's just not right. I mean, there's a verse in I think it's Second Corinthians that talks about the neglect of a marriage, and
Right.
how that needs to be taken care of. And Malachi, when we say God hates divorce, the rest of that verse is God hates divorce and the man who clothes his garment, which is his wife, in violence. And
Right.
so we can't cherry pick, and I think we've done that for many years, the church has in general, and pick out the type of verses that we want to put out there, right, without taking the whole context the whole passage into context as far as definition and all of that.
A lot of people don't realize that Malachi 2:16, which was translated for the very first time in 1611 as God hates divorce,
Mm.
and was only popular for 385 years. People actually think that's the oldest and most traditional way of interpreting Malachi 2:16. The book of Malachi was written 2,400 years ago, and for the first 2,100 years, it was never interpreted as God hates divorce. It was viewed as an anti-treachery verse, because that's what goes along with Malachi 2:14, where God says, hey, you men, don't you come crying to me and asking me why I don't accept your offerings. Let me tell you why I don't accept your offerings and your prayers. It's because you are cruel to your wives. And so for the first 2,100 years, Malachi 2:16 was viewed as an anti-treachery verse. That means John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, John Calvin never interpreted that verse as God hates divorce. So King James was the King James version was the first version of the Bible to ever interpret it that way. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s, and it took about 50 years to completely analyze them and finally publish them and make them available to the public. Since the time that Malachi, the book of Malachi, was finally published from the Dead Sea Scroll collection, no new major Bible translation has ever interpreted Malachi 2:16 as God hates divorce. Not the NIV 2011 update, not the ESV, the English Standard Version, the Bible used by so many Reformed churches, and not the Christian Standard Bible published by Lifeway, the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. even the translators of the New International Version, the NIV, prior to the publishing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did say God hates divorce in their earlier edition. But when they revised their translation in 2011, they changed it. So we need to stop thinking of God hates divorce as being the oldest or the traditional interpretation of that verse. It's not, and it never has been.
I appreciate that. I did find a blog post online that's been, and I don't remember the address, but we can give it to our listeners later, that talks about the Hebrew, what it really says and what the words really mean and how it doesn't really mean that at all. So, but it's good to hear that as well. Well, we are out of time. I would like to let people know how to find you. Is it the lifesavingdivorce.com website?
Yes, it is. Yes, lifesavingdivorce.com.
All right.
And I'd strongly recommend people look in particular, if this is of interest to you, look particularly at my article at lifesavingdivorce.com/12facts. If the Malachi information I just gave you blew your socks off, I have lifesavingdivorce.com/Malachi, MALICHI. And I've got a lot of articles on kids and divorce. Let me just say something very quickly. I know you want to keep this tight, but no-fault divorce was first introduced into the United States in the state of California by then Governor Ronald Reagan in 1969. And then state after state, it was adopted because, of course, there is no federal divorce law in the United States. And all the universities, all the grad schools, and all the grad students from the major universities lined up to see what this major societal shift would do. What would it do to families, marriages, the crime rate, domestic violence rates, homicide rates, suicide rates? What would it do to children? Would it destroy children? Would they not marry? Would they divorce too? And so an army of family researchers and family sociologists lined up in 1970 to start studying the effects of no-fault divorce when we made divorce just a little easier to get. And it is so important that we learn the truth that they learned. And you'll find that in my blog post, the lifesavingdivorce.com/12facts. Because if we continue to give false information like many Christian organizations do, especially a very large one that has a lot of radio broadcasts, we are basically misleading people with unreliable, false, and fraudulent information.
Yes, thanks for that. I will definitely be looking up your articles, and we may, if it's okay with you, link to some of them on the ARMS website to your information as well, because I think it's super valuable information that I'll be looking through those. So thank you, Gretchen. I'm so glad you came today. You made time for us. Like I said, I know you're busy, so I really, really appreciate it. Your book is important and vital, and needs to be out there to more people, and to understand that, divorce is often called for, literally. And as organizations that work with, people who are abusive, and, in other cases, there's very destructive behaviors that can go on that we need to put a stop to, and we can't change the other person. And so eventually, sometimes it does come down to separation or divorce from that person. So thank you very much for coming. We truly appreciate you. We will put links to your website and all of that, and I will let you know when we go live with when we get it posted, so that you can watch it as well. And we appreciate you coming. Thank you so, so much.
You're very welcome, Julie, and thank you. Lord bless you and the work you are doing with abused spouses. I just pray that people will find you. I'm so glad you reached out. I did go over your website. What an amazing resource. And thank God you exist. I'm just so thrilled.
Thank you. We're thrilled too, and God will take it where God takes it. We've actually been around 25 years, but we're just now really getting our, getting our groupers in, and becoming a voice out there. So we do appreciate your support, and ARMS has helped thousands of people, and we wanted to help thousands more.
All right. Thank
You
you.
again. It was good to see you.